Good day everyone, but especially all of the history enjoyers, or more likely all of the mythology enjoyers, because today, April the 21st, is the 1270th anniversary of the founding of Rome by Romulus. That totally happened. Now, what we have for today is some very good news for pretty much all of the player base enjoying Mythic Plus. Now, in Season 2, we are getting Afflicted, we are getting Incorporeal, and we are getting Entangling as the new affixes, with some of the current affixes saying goodbye and no longer plaguing us with their annoyance. In particular, the last of the changes to these affixes leaving was the addition of Explosive. Blizzard tried to fix it a few times, to rework it a few times. In the end, they gave up. They said, fine, we can't make you happy with Explosive, let's fuck him off and bring back one of the fan favorites, mostly because you have to do nothing when this fan favorite is in play, which was Volcanic, right? So things were getting better in Mythic Plus with some changes from Blizzard, but we still had two problems. Problem number one was Incorporeal, and problem number two was Afflicted. Entangling, the third affix, was already fine enough. Blizzard even nerfed it for you. Now, you're not slowed by 50% when you have this vine around you that slows you, but only by 30%. So it's even easier to get rid of Entangling. However, we still had those two issues, which would have made Mythic Plus quite miserable, in particularly Afflicted. For those who are not aware or already forgot how this affix is going to work, Afflicted is a mob that spawns with 3 debuffs on itself. One is a curse, one is a poison, and one is a disease. And it's also at 1 HP. It's gonna cast for 10 seconds, and if you let the cast go through, you're gonna get a 100% haste debuff on you. The only way to get rid of this mob is to either heal him to full or dispel him in any of the 3 ways. A disease dispel, a poison dispel, or a curse dispel. What was the issue of this affix? Because seemingly it was quite simple. The mob spawns, the healer targets it, clicks on one of his dispels, and the mob goes away. Job done. The problem is that this mob was working like Explosive uses to work, which means the more mobs you are pulling, the more of these afflicted mobs are going to spawn. You could get to certain points where you are pulling 10 mobs, let's say, and 6 afflicted mobs were spawning. So how were you going to deal with 6 mobs in 10 seconds? 6 mobs that need to be dispelled in 10 seconds when your dispel has an 8-second cooldown. 6 mobs that need to be healed to full HP in 10 seconds when your party is also fighting 10 enemies. How was that going to work? Finally, Blizzard decided to nerf this affix by quite a lot. What it seems to be right now, the change in the PTR, is that afflicted mobs now have a cap in the amount of mobs that can spawn at the same time, and that cap is 2. On top of that, to make sure the cap stays at 2, they have an internal cooldown of 15 seconds, which means after the first 2 mobs have spawned, then they can no longer spawn for 15 more seconds, right? That's the new change for this affix. This now makes this affix a much more manageable, a much more doable affix. As a matter of fact, this affix can now be soloed by any spec, not just the healers, any spec with a dispel. Why is that? Because the casts of these mobs you want to interrupt is 10 seconds long, and your dispel has an 8-second cooldown. No matter if it's a curse dispel, if it's a disease dispel, or if it's a poison dispel, it's gonna have an 8-second cooldown across all classes. Even for mages, for druids not being resto, for shamans not being restoration, it's still gonna have an 8-second cooldown. Which means, if you are fast enough, once the first 2 are spawning, if you are quick enough to dispel the first one, you're gonna get your dispel off cooldown to dispel the second one before his cast goes off. So it's basically soloable by a single player. And of course, the more players you have with a dispel, the more trivial this is going to be. Considering the amount of specs who have a dispel available, is going to make it very, very simple to simply deal with these 2. Basically, in the simplest scenario, you're gonna have 2 mobs spawning and 2 players in your party have 10 seconds of time. 10 seconds to target one and dispel one. That's how simple this affix is going to be. So it's definitely not going to be nearly as simple as volcanic or as simple as storming, but now with this change, only 2 of them spawning, and only spawning with at least a 15-second gap between the different spawns, now it's a much more manageable and much easier, much less stressful type of affix to deal with. You could say the biggest of the issues right now will be convincing the DPS players to actually take the Dispel talent in their tree to be able to help with this affix. But besides that, now it's a very manageable affix. The other problem in Mythic Plus was Incorporeal. So Incorporeal was the other type of affix which had mobs spawning like Afflicted. This one was already at a cap of 2 at a time. So this one was already fixed at 2 of them spawning, and they were spawning and casting once again this spell which was going to reduce the damage done by the players by 50%. So you wanted to stop them from casting. Unlike Incorporeal, it wasn't about healing them or dispelling them, it was purely about crowd control. So you had 20 seconds of time. They were going to live for 20 seconds and you simply had to stop them from casting this for 20 seconds. And also any form of crowd control that wasn't an AoE crowd control, so any type of, for example, AoE stun or AoE fear was not going to work, but single target crowd control, any kind of single target crowd control was going to work on these mobs. Furthermore, these mobs were also going to automatically disappear once you exit combat with the normal mobs of the dungeon. You know, to make it less annoying, like for example, you are killing the last mob of the pack, ready to move on the boss, and as the last mob is dying, 2 more are spawning. So now you are stuck for 20 seconds interrupting these things before you can move to the boss. So Blizzard fixed that by making them disappear if you exit combat with the normal mobs of the dungeons. What is the change in this new cycle of PTR? The change is that now, while the cap of these spawning mobs is still 2 maximum, now there is also just 1 that can spawn every time instead of 2. So it's even easier now to deal with it. What is the change in, we can say, the negative perhaps, is that unlike Afflicted, which has a 15-second window in the spawns, but it's not certain, it's not on the dot. It's the next round of Afflicted can only spawn after 15 seconds, but it can also spawn after 20 or 25 seconds. It's not that precise. With Incorporeal, right now, it seems to be on the dot. So the first 2 spawn, and after 20 seconds, exactly on the dot, after 20, the next round spawns. And then, exactly after 20 seconds, the next round spawns. So it's a much more cyclical, much more continuous type of spawning of this affix throughout your key. Now, why this could be slightly annoying is that this puts a lot of extra weight on who can have the proper crowd control to deal with this mob. For example, these mobs, as mentioned, are still fully susceptible to all sorts of crowd control, given that it is single target. For example, crowd controls like Polymorph, like Hex, like Shackle Undead, because these mobs have all tags of mobs on them. So you can shackle them even if they're not undead, you can polymorph them even if they're not humanoids, and you can hex them, for example, regardless of what type of enemies they are. So all of these long crowd controls are going to be very useful on these mobs, especially since Blizzard changed them to be immune to damage. So no crowd control is ever going to be broken on these mobs because they simply do not take damage. So it's very simple for you to have 2 of these spawning, and if you have a mage and a shaman, the mage polymorphs the left one, the shaman hexes the right one, and you're done. However, what happens if instead of having a mage, you have a death knight, and instead of having a shaman, you have a warrior? Well, what happens is that the death knight and the warrior can't really do anything to these mobs long term. They have to single target stun them with Stormbolt with a long cooldown. They have to waste, so to speak, they have to waste their interrupt on them rather than on the dangerous mobs of the dungeon that you're fighting. So having these incorporeal mobs on this continuous 20-second cycle is going to put certain specs with powerful long crowd controls at a higher priority level than the other types of specs without really too much of a useful long-term type of crowd control. That is perhaps the main issue, the main fear that this might cause in Mythic Plus for certain types of specs which won't be nearly as needed or nearly as wanted in Mythic Plus in these type of weeks when Incorporeal is going to be active. So with this round of change on the PTR, there is a great all around, no ifs or buts. The changes to Afflicted are very, very good across the board. They make it a very easy affix now. Meanwhile, the ones for Incorporeal still make it very easy for the specs who do have the right type of long crowd control, and perhaps slightly more annoying and still more challenging for the specs who don't have access to this type of long crowd control on them. Overall, still, I would say, still positive set of changes to the Mythic Plus affixes in this cycle of the PTR. So with this, we are done with the changes on this Friday. I would say overall positive changes to Mythic Plus for today on this Friday, and according to some, the beginning on the weekend, and according to others, the founding of Rome. I'm going to leave you to the rest of your day. We are starting, of course, the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel. You can still, of course, support in plenty of other free ways. You can, for example, like and comment down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. You can also follow me over on my Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream on Twitch. So with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, that's it. All that's left now is to pull up the blinds.